So I've been asked to just introduce our speakers. I'm Jane Bishop. I'm sitting in Seashelt in the village, about 500 meters from the original village of Chatleach here in the land of the Seashell people. And I just want to say that our speakers tonight are Harley Eagle, who is a Dakota and Ojibwe, a member of the Whitecap Dakota First Nation, an Indigenous facilitator and consultant, who's worked extensively in allyship with Dana Hubler, who is a physician. And the little piece I've been given tells me that she is a settler born in the traditional territory of the Tsimshian people and raises her family on the land of the Comox Nation. She works clinically with FNHA, which is the First Nation Health Authority, as well as supporting practice improvements at the UBC Rural CPD Medical Director and a physician advisor with the Island Health PQI program. And that's all I have to say today, except that the meeting is being recorded, and enjoy these incredibly talented facilitators.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bishop, and thank you everybody for being with us tonight. It's really nice to be here, and I just want to acknowledge the unceded traditional territories from which I'm calling in from tonight. I'm not in my location, which is in the territory of the Comox people. I'm on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands tonight, calling in from Vancouver. And just if it's a part of your practice to give a land acknowledgement in the chat, if that's become something that you've done in meetings and gatherings, please feel that you can do that here. We would love to see that if it's a part of your practice. And I'm going to start sharing my screen here with you, which helps me to stay on track. And if I could get a thumbs up, Ben, maybe that you can see my full screen. Okay, thank you so much. So we're here for number 4 of our 5-part series, looking at elements of Indigenous cultural safety. And you'll see that they're the medicine wheel. And really, I'm so thankful for the physician advisory group that helped to put this together. And the voice was loud and clear that, making sure that we come from the perspective of what I like to call the genius and brilliance of Indigenous people's ways of knowing and being and walking in this world for thousands of years. Sometimes we only focus on the last few hundred years and all of the colonial activity, but it's important to remember that for thousands of years, Indigenous people have been on these lands and living in societies where I think we figured out a few things, and certainly the medicine wheel, there's lots of teachings around that help to consider balance and consider how to walk in this world in a good way and how to walk with each other in a good way. And that's really the focus of our work tonight, is to look at allyship and what that looks like. And really from the lived experience of somebody who's been on this journey for a number of years. And Dana and I have been working together for a number of years as well. So we bring in our experience of what it means to be journeying together. But we certainly will focus on Dana's thoughts and perspective and journey of what it means to be an ally. And I just in a few moments here, I'll just give a little bit of background to why we're here. And I think it's important to repeat things, because I know for me in my own journey of embracing cultural safety, it's been in the last 10 years or so that I've really jumped into cultural safety, and that's built on many years of working on anti-oppression and Indigenous rights advocacy and trauma-informed practice and anti-racism and those sorts of things, which are all elements of cultural safety. But I find that I still continue to learn, even in what you might think as simple things like a definition of cultural safety. And First Nations Health Authority, has a definition which I'll share in a few moments. But I keep finding little nuggets in those definitions that help me to understand, how to walk with this on this journey, and how to walk with others on this journey as well. So we continue to learn, and we learn from repetition as well. So as a reminder, in our first session, we did some work around foundational elements of cultural safety, and then we listened to the wonderful Nalaga, who shared with us the experience of being Indigenous and the things that she's lived through, and she's connected it to her healing journey as well, which is very much connected to, once again, the genius and brilliance of Indigenous peoples and ways of knowing and being. And then we had the wonderful Dr. Ral Gupta join us for session number 3, where we looked at the polyvagal theory and what it means to look within ourselves, to see how we can address and work with our own patterns of anxiety and stress, which help with regulation and help us to show up in those kinds of situations in the best way that we can as well. And then tonight, we're going to focus on allyship and co-journeying together, and talk about some of the concepts, some of the ideas, some of those things that have served Dr. Hubler on her journey, and hopefully then will help you as well in your journey too. So, and we also want to just acknowledge that, it's really important to set the tone for doing Indigenous cultural safety work. So I often mentioned, the word protocols. The root of that word actually means first glue, and it's speaking to the beginnings of important documents or even books. And Indigenous people have always done customs and protocols at the beginnings of gatherings, and sometimes we just kind of see them as customs. It's just something we do, but really they're designed to activate the glue that holds us together as individuals, to remind us of those teachings and values and principles that are important for us to carry as individuals when we're doing important work. And then as families and as communities, all of those things that help us to stay present, even in the face of difficult decisions or conflict or whatever it may be, or even celebration. How do we show up in the best way possible? And that's what setting the tone is. That's what protocols are. And that's what's really helpful for creating culturally safe settings as well. That tone setting becomes very important. And we certainly need that right now in terms of what we're living through in this world, the pandemic that isn't over. We're seeing, just terrible things that every day it seems on the news. It's just tragedy and violence and things that we just, in some ways, just don't understand, but are impacting us. So we know that we're carrying a lot from many different perspectives and many different experiences in this world. So it's important to remember to be kind and gentle with ourselves, because all of us are carrying a lot. And I'm sure many of you have come from very busy days as well. So in this moment, you're carrying a lot as well, let alone those big things that are happening around us. So please be kind and gentle with yourself. And that helps us to be kind and gentle with each other as well. So even in this moment, if you want to take a few deep breaths, to calm yourself, to center yourself, Dr. Ral Gupta shared with us some techniques that help us to stay centered and regulated, or to bring us back into regulation. So if you have those techniques with you in your journey, in your practice, maybe do some of those right now that help you to settle into our time together. And that's really helpful too, because the nature of this talk can be very difficult when we start looking at the dynamics of the history and the ongoing reality of colonization here in this country. We know that it's not easy to do. So staying regulated and staying centered is really helpful when we're looking into these to the context in which we find ourselves. And we can also take heart that we are doing what we're being called to do. The TRC calls to action. This work that we're doing is designed to pay attention to those calls to action, and from other sources as well, like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and those recommendations, the In Plain Sight report. There's several that we can look to, and that's what we're doing in this moment. So we know we are taking direction from those many voices that have talked and spoken to the problems that are around us and the impact of colonization, and the recommendations as well. So what can we start doing to make a difference? And we are doing that in this moment. And then a reminder that the perspective of Indigenous cultural safety, some people call it systems view or the balcony view. a skydiver's view. It's stepping back for a moment and trying to look at the big picture. And that's what cultural safety is. So that's what we're trying to do here, is to provide us all a big picture of what's been going on in this world, and then even ways that we can walk in this world as well. And cultural safety really is about looking at the colonial structures, those patterns of colonization that are ever present in our lives, and trying to figure out, so what is useful in those structures and what needs to be changed, and then how can we actually make some change to those colonial structures that are ever present. And for those of you that carry stories and life experiences and are from other parts of the world, you might start to see similarities in your own experiences around colonization. And we like to remind people of that because, not only are your stories important to this work, but you'll make those connections to your own experiences. And they also provide us a way of seeing how colonization is a global phenomena. And as you've heard me talk about before, the older story of colonization, that there's also a longer history to colonization than we often think about. It's not just here in Canada and the United States that it happens. It's happened in other parts of the world, and also in many different time eras as well. And when we start to share our stories, we realize the power of our stories, all of our stories, and coming from a place of vulnerability is really important in this work. And when we are able to gather in person and do cultural safety work, we often use the talking circle process. And that helps us to engage in a real human way, a way of building community and building understanding among each other, and understanding of ourselves as well. And so that really does need to come from a place of vulnerability. And it's not an easy thing to do. And oftentimes, notions of shame and other things distract us from going to a place of vulnerability. But we know that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. It helps to melt how shame keeps us from those deep places. But we need to go to those deep places to move forward, and especially in a creative and innovative way. So vulnerability is very important to the work of cultural safety. And the origins and the definition that we look to, or one of the definitions that we look to, are also very important. I always like to give thanks to the Maori people of New Zealand, because this concept came out of their work, over 30 years ago now, and primarily from the healthcare world. And primarily it was Maori nurses who brought this forward, the need for this deeper understanding of what it means to create safe settings for their own people, the Indigenous people of New Zealand, especially when they witnessed and saw moments when patients were treated in a discriminatory fashion, whether it was because of a language barrier, or maybe even those Maori people who still practice the old ways. Sometimes they would be ridiculed and discriminated against. So they wanted to make sure that the hospital setting and healthcare setting started to provide safe places and safe practice for those patients and across difference. And also for the ability for Indigenous people to share, their knowledge, their experiences, to teach about their culture and languages and that sort of thing. So there's that deeper understanding. So cultural safety includes that as well. The one of the definitions that we like to use comes from First Nations Health Authority, and I like to use this one too because it again allows me to lift up First Nations Health Authority for the work that they've since 2013 to amplify the need for and what cultural safety is, especially in the healthcare setting. So their definition is an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address those power imbalances. So think back to that picture I just shared with you with the road on the picture or on the scenery. That's what this is striving to do, is to look at those power imbalances and those structures that can be oppressive. And hopefully then it results in an environment free of racism and discrimination when we're doing something about those structures and patterns. But it's an aspirational place. We have a long way to go, and that work isn't easy. And so the next definition I want to share with you that also comes from First Nations Health Authority is about, so how do we get there? how do we be on this journey? And certainly cultural humility and working from a process of self-reflection to understand our own biases and what's going on inside of us, and then how those patterns might show up in the systems around us as well. And we need respectful processes that are built on mutual trust that can help us on that journey. And so we'll talk more from that angle today, certainly from the point of view of what it means to be an ally in this work. And the learning process is really basically that it's important to know where we've come from, if you will, to understand the history of colonization and how it shows up in our everyday reality as well. And not only is it academic understanding, it's also, so how do we fit into that picture as well as individuals, and maybe from our own family's experience or our people's experience as well. So that deeper understanding beyond just knowledge is important. And then the second step is around skills. So what kind of skills utilize? And certainly Dr. Gupta spoke to skills that are helpful last session, and Nalaga also spoke to the skills that they've recognized as really important in this work. And then hopefully if we build our understanding and our knowledge and start using skills and amplify skills that are helpful, we can move towards collaborative and emergent action to create change as well. And I also want to say, I think we're already seeing some of those elements, some of those collaborative actions happening. Certainly the TRC recommendations can be seen as a collaborative emergent action that came out of a long process of looking at the history and the impact of residential schools. So that's an example of emergent and collaborative actions that came out of that process. And we're starting to see some of those shifts as well in the healthcare world. And then again, just to reiterate that tone setting is very important in this work, because we have to build that container that can hold the content that often is uncomfortable. And especially when we start looking inward at ourselves, there has to be that container that can hold that. And the last definition that I want to share with you is more along the lines of looking at the nature and the patterns of systemic oppression, and looking at systemic racism is really helpful, because we want people to understand that systemic racism or racism isn't just those ugly interactions between individuals. There's a lot more to it as well. And so we dig down deeper and we look at the history and we make connections to the environment and to the context and to society in general, to understand patterns that are embedded in our society that create the distrust and create the dynamics that of interpersonal interactions that are based on bigoted behaviors and that sort of thing. And so we look to things like understanding things like the Indian Act and the reserve system and the doctrine of discovery, all of those big elements that are still present in our lives and in our society, but we often don't know about them. But that's a part of understanding systemic racism. And then to understand that we're shaped by those patterns. And a lot of times those patterns are invisible. We don't notice them because they've just become normalized, but then that shapes the way that we see ourselves and that we see each other and the way we see the environment. It creates that environment where we end up treating those around us for whatever reason as if they are lesser or more value than others. And where we want to get to in all of this, when we try to understand that big picture and the patterns of oppression that are within our society, we want to get to this place. And this quote comes from Indigenous people from Australia and primarily attributed to Lila Watson, but she's always careful to say it came out of a group, out of group work, out of a collaborative. But she said it in a speech, but it came out of many people that realized that this was important. That if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Dana Hubler at this point. And in a few moments, Dana, I'll ask you to provide an introduction or whatever you want to say about yourself and your location. But I just want to let folks know too that the process for our time with Dr. Hubler is we're going to do a bit of an interview style. And Dan and I have talked about this before, and we've actually engaged in this process in some ways in the past as well. So we know it's really helpful. So after we do an interview for a while, we're going to provide space at the end for questions and comments. But if you have something that's on your mind in the moment, please utilize the chat. And I know that some people don't like to use the chat either. It's more difficult when they're trying to listen and then trying to type at the same time. So just know that you will have space at the end to ask questions and to make comments as well. And these are the themes that we're going to focus on. And I'll be sure to let you know where we're at in the interview process. But we're going to talk about what does allyship mean to you, and what have been the steps for allyship that have been important to you, and what would you like to say to ally, or for folks that want to be on this journey? What's your advice, based on your experience? And then I'll be asking Dana, what does it mean to journey together in this work? And in Dana's experience, what has she been hearing from Indigenous colleagues and communities about what is important to them to pay attention to? And then we're going to talk about, I consider community as a practice a skill, so it helps to build skill. And so we're going to talk about that and what communities of practice have meant to Dana on her journey. And then lastly, we're going to address the question about, those people that maybe aren't willing to hear, why, willing to consider or even to hear about cultural safety, and what has been some of Dana's experience on reaching out to people that maybe aren't willing or don't want to hear about this journey. So that'll be our process for tonight. And I also wanted to just lift up our previous speakers here, because certainly Dana has deep relationship with them as well, and they've offered a lot of insight and have journeyed alongside Dana as well. So we just wanted to bring their faces and their teachings into our session tonight. And I know Dr. Gupta is here with us as well. And then Dana always speaks very highly about what she's learning from compassionate leadership teachings and coaching. And Sean and Heather Atleo are primarily providing that understanding for many people in the healthcare setting, but certainly Dana, and she'll speak to that as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if there's, I'm just going to quickly check the chat, see if there's anything in there I need to pay attention to. It looks like we're all clear. So at this point, Dana, I will turn it over to you for however you would like to introduce yourself.
Great. Well, thank you, Harley. And it's so lovely to be here. And I see so many friends and colleagues in the virtual crowd, which is lovely and reassuring. I am really, really honored to be here as a guest of Harley. When Harley asked me to do something, I almost always am just going to say yes. And so when he asked me to do this, I didn't really know what it was. And then it was about allyship. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then he realized, I want you to speak about your allyship. And I was really struck because it really hit my heart, because it made me realize, oh, there have been moments in my time with Harley where he's felt I've been an ally. And that, because being an ally isn't a title you acquire. And so it's something that you learn, whether you have been or you haven't been, by feedback from those who you are working with. And so I'm just really honored that there have been moments that Harley has felt I have been a good co-journeyer and a good ally in our time together. So I'm Dana. I'm a family doctor. I'm a mom of 2 teenage girls. My mom is Sandy, and she is Danish and English, and my dad is Dan, and he is Swiss and French. And that's probably how I would have introduced myself until my work with Indigenous elders and Indigenous thought leaders and Indigenous friends who said, well, who are you? Who are your people? And I think what that has taken me on a journey is to realize, okay, who are my people that have brought me to this beautiful territory where the Comox and Pentlich and Ixon and Anzatlu people have shepherded and stewarded the land so beautifully. And what I realized through that work is, actually my people were persecuted in Europe. I'm actually a Huguenot as I dug deeper into it. And we were persecuted by the Catholic Church in France, and we fled into Switzerland, landed there as refugees, really, and then kind of gathered ourselves a little bit and then headed off to another land. And I think that all has let me understand why my ancestors landed on this territory and acted in really poor ways. And I think it gives me, some context for the work I need to do, for the work I can do, with my family, with myself, to try to be a better ancestor going forward. And so, yeah, I'm just really glad to be here for this conversation, Harley.
Thanks so much for that, Dana. And I was just reflecting, Dana, that I think the first time we met was in a cultural safety session through Island Health. And that was probably in 2016 or somewhere around there, when Dana was doing a lot of work in Port Alice in a small remote community. And I had worked in Port Alice for many years and lived in Port Hardy for many years. So we also have that connection to smaller communities and rural and remote communities as well. And that's been a big part of the work that we've done together and focus of the work that we've done together. But in that moment, I remember that particular session, there was some difficult. We had a couple participants where it was a lot of discomfort and a lot of reaction to the discomfort. And I remember Dana really helped with her own story to help people. It really helped to calm those that were feeling somewhat discomfort in that concept of looking at your own history, especially if you're of European descent. So that's when I noticed that here's somebody who's done some work and has made some connections, and that was helpful. We came to realize later that why there was two people in particular that were struggling in that workshop is because they had missed somehow doing the pre-work, and so they hadn't come in prepared. Their tone hadn't been set for them, and so they were quite agitated when they came in. But the words from Dana and just really helped to change that setting, and so ever since then we've started working together and doing this kind of work as well. So Dana, you mentioned allyship a few times, and the title of this workshop is allyship, but we know that that's not a perfect word for all of this. Sometimes we trouble that word in and of itself, and sometimes we call that concept of allyship co-conspirators, and there's other words, and I like the word co-journeyer as well. But I like too how you mentioned that. Well, what came up for me when you were talking about allyship, it's almost like it's a verb, right? It's an action, and it's a lived experience. It's not a title that you attain. It's a part of who you become and how you do this work. But that's not the goal, is to be considered an ally, but it's the way that you walk in this world. And so I would like to hear a little bit more about, from your perspective, of what allyship means to you.
I think it is being in the moment, trying to self-reflect and realize where there are places where I can give up power, where I can recognize that there's power imbalances, where I can do way more listening than talking. I think I have all kinds of good ideas, and I could talk about them. And what I realize is one of the things is actually to do way less talking and way more listening. And Elder Roberta Price, who many of you will know, she's a brilliant woman, and she is changing the world. And she reminds me, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. That's what the Creator gave us, she'll say. And so I think a lot of that is stepping back, doing a lot more listening, and making a real commitment to trying to recognize and unlearn. You know, when I went through the education system, I learned that the United States was a melting pot. In Canada, we were a mosaic. And, you know, we came across and we settled these lands that were largely kind of unused and empty. And we had, you know, good relations. There were a few battles here and there, but, you know, overall, you know, we raised the GDP of this land. And so a lot of it is being humble to unlearn some of those things. Some of that requires a lot of discomfort, and not so much so that I'm harming myself. You know, I think that's one of the things I've learned from Sean and Heather is we need to be compassionate with ourselves. And so I try to be compassionate with myself and not live in a place of guilt and shame, because those are paralyzing, but to really accept responsibility for, you know, how my ancestors came to this land and recognize, you know, the moments where I can try to unlearn and undo, go the extra mile, speak up, and try to do it in a way that doesn't add harm, that contributes to the well-being of us all.
That's so a wonderful and really robust understanding of what this journey means to you. And my next question would be around, you know, what important steps that you can reflect back on in your journey, you know, that stand out to you. And you've already named quite a few of them. You talked about recognizing and giving up power, and then also listening and way less talking, and unlearning is a part of all of this too. Learning to be compassionate with yourself. So those are really powerful steps that you're speaking to already. And so I'm going to ask you if there's anything else that you want to add that you've recognized as that's been really important to you on this journey. And then just before you speak to that, I'll give you a minute to think about that. Just to point out to our participants here, our friends here on this call, did you notice how Dana was speaking to history? She was so it's obvious that she's done some learning and unlearning about the history of Canada, and she's speaking to that perspective of that older story of what's or the secrets that have been kept about the history of Canada. So she brought that skill in around cultural safety and knowing about the history, certainly from Indigenous perspectives. And so back to you, Dana, about, you know, are there any other steps that you would like to lift up or talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is so much about learning and unlearning as a really foundational piece, so that when I come into relationship and interactions with Indigenous people, I'm not expecting them to educate me, and I'm trying to add as little harm as I can. I still do. I still misstep. There's still things where I think, oh God, that was so dumb. Like maybe I've really hurt somebody. But I really do try to do my best to learn and unlearn. And so, you know, some of that is through courses in education. A lot of it is through Indigenous art, Indigenous writers, Indigenous filmmakers, Indigenous musicians, Indigenous speakers. There's so much richness in learning through the arts and through story, so that when I do come into relationship, I'm less likely to add harm. I know I will. I'm white. I was born in a racist society. I learned a whole bunch of untruths. So I know, and I try to be gentle with myself, that I am going to misstep, but that I also have some self-care practices that allow me to kind of regulate so I can stay in the moment and try to make the repair when I've misstepped. But I think Indigenous communities are so busy. They are busy grieving. They are busy protecting their language. They are busy trying to retrieve their language. They are trying to retrieve their cultural practices. And it is grief upon grief upon grief. And so I want to do the work through courses, through reading, through films, in any way that I can, so that I'm not wanting to put more work on them. because they're busy communities. They are busy people doing the work of trying to survive this hundreds of years of attempting to wipe them out very deliberately. And I think some of that it's hard to learn. It's hard to hear I know the first time I read genocide applied to the history of Canada and Indigenous peoples, I really had a reaction to that. I thought, well, it's not genocide. Genocide happened in Cambodia. Genocide happened in Rwanda. Genocide happened in the Holocaust. And then to really sit with and read the documents, read the papal bulls, read the Doctrine of Discovery, and realize, no, this was really deliberate, and these are my ancestors. That's hard. It's hard. It's upsetting. But I think, having ways to regulate myself and sit with that and to try to respond to it and not react to it. It's hard work, but I think I don't recoil from that word genocide because I've read the documents. I see what it was. And I try not to sit in guilt and shame because I have the opportunity to try to go forward in a different way, raise kids who are going to go forward in a different way. And I get to work for the First Nations Health Authority that has built systems, by and for Indigenous people that work differently, that are trying to undo some of the patterns of harm.
Thanks so much, Dan. I think you said something really important that sometimes gets kind of breezed over, and that's repair. And you've already spoken to it, but can you say a little bit more about why that's important to consider? Because you said it so well and a few times about making mistakes, that this process, there mistakes will be made. But then you talked about the importance of repair as well. So what can you say about the process of repair?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be a racist. I want to be one of the good guys, right? And I've come to the place to realize that I was born in this country, in this culture that was set up with racism as one of its foundational building principles. And so I've come to that place of like, of course I'm racist. And if I try to keep that front of mind and not recoil that ugly word and that ugly thought and push it away, then I'm probably going to be safer. And so then I move in the world. I try to move in the world, recognizing that I will cause harm, because how could I not? And one of the beautiful things that I think I've heard Harley that was so called me in was talking about him being a man in this world that is inherently sexist, that we are all working to try to change that, but that his job is to just recognize that, and it's just a fact, and that's something he has to manage. And so for me also then, as a white settler, I was born with racist thoughts, with racist practices, with racist laws, and so I'm gonna make mistakes. I'm gonna slip, especially if I'm tired and I'm hungry and I'm triggered. And so accepting that, I think has made me safer. And so then I can sit, if someone says, Dana, that didn't land very well for me, or that really hurt when you said that, or what did you mean? I still don't like it. I don't want to, that's not how I want to move in the world, but I'm able to hear it. And then I'm actually able to solicit feedback so that I'm safer. And then I can just say, I am really sorry. And now I've realized that when Indigenous friends and colleagues offer me feedback about when I've made a mistake, it's a sign that they've recognized that I'm safe enough to give that feedback to. And so it's transformed how I feel about it. I feel like if I'm actually getting some of that feedback, I shouldn't be getting it every day. I shouldn't be getting it every interaction. That's on me if that's the case. But when I do get that feedback, then it's a sign that, someone feels safe enough to give it to me. And then it's on me to say, I'm sorry. and then really attempt not to do it again, or dig into what led to that interaction. I'm just thinking of an interaction with a patient. So I worked with the First Nations Health Authority. All of my patients are Indigenous, and 99.9% of the interactions, I have to say, from my perspective, are really enriching experiences for me. And every once in a while, there's a collision. And this is a couple of years ago, and someone was, really in a dysregulated state, and really wanted me to prescribe something that I just didn't feel was going to be safe for them, and it wasn't going to leave me feeling good about that, and that I felt like there was other things that I could offer this person other than that particular prescription. And I was called, you're so racist, and I'm gonna, and it was really hit my heart, because that isn't how I want to be. And I think 10 years ago, I might have been really reactive. I might have been really like, that's so offensive, and this relationship can't carry on, and we've obviously lost our therapeutic alliance. And what I recognized in myself is what my response was, I know, and I'm really trying. I'm really working on it. And here's what here's what I'd like to be able to do for you. But I didn't recoil from the word, because I know that's one of the things I'm having to unlearn.
So if somebody came to you and said, I would like to increase my ability to be an ally, or maybe they're realizing, I think I need to be an ally, but maybe they haven't been on that journey at all. What kind of advice would you give to them, to somebody that's new to the journey, or thinking that they would like to be on this journey in a little more of an intentional manner? What kind of advice kind of comes to your mind that you would give somebody like that?
I would say trauma-informed practice as a really foundational thing, so that we learn how to regulate ourselves, and we also learn how to recognize when someone else is triggered, and so that we don't add harm, and we can stay in uncomfortable situations and not add harm. I think that I would say find a community of practice, and I know of other people that are working at this, that are trying to do this work, so who are not Indigenous themselves, so that it's a group of you, so that you have a place to go to when things go wrong, and you're not always leaning on your Indigenous friend or your Indigenous colleague to give you feedback or to help you undo something that has gone wrong. So I think that community of practice has been really helpful. And I think dig into the learning, right? Do the work, read books, watch films, really. Not only are you supporting Indigenous artists, but you're actually really getting a heartfelt historical, a history lesson that is a new one from what you've learned.
I think that's a really helpful response, especially around do that learning. I know we're seeing that at an organizational level with some of the work that we're doing with other organizations, is what they've come to realize is that if they want to attract Indigenous people to work with them, they can't just go out and hire Indigenous people. They have to get ready. They have to do that learning. They have to figure out, how are our patterns not safe? How are they not trauma informed? How do we get ourselves ready so that the setting is safer for Indigenous people? And it's almost like that's what you're saying, is do that pre-work, start with yourself, do that work to get yourself ready. So that you can start walking as an ally. I really appreciate Ray's, Dr. Chaboy's comment there. The term therapeutic alliance is extremely important in providing culturally safe care. And it has me thinking about the next question that I wanted to ask you, and that's about journeying together. because journeying together is like an alliance, right? And I mean, ally comes out of the word alliance. So what does journeying together mean to you?
I think it's finding spaces where I can add my energy and passion to try to help undo harmful patterns, and to not do it for or about anybody, to do it with, to do it in ways where I am, I'm willing to lean in and do some of the hard work so that Indigenous people can spend a lot of their energy in community working with Indigenous people, as together, but that I can lend my energy and time to be helpful, to listen, to learn, and to try to undo and essentially decolonize practices that really harm all of us.
So in that listening that you've been doing, and as Dr. Elder Roberta Price speaks to, remembering that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so speak less and listen more. What are some of the things that you've been hearing over the years from Indigenous peoples and from Indigenous communities that you think would be helpful to raise up in this moment? So what are some of those things that you're hearing?
Revitalizing language. Like, there's a language emergency. There is an emergency of elders who hold knowledge. Elders are a very, very precious resource for populations that are trying to save their language and save their practices, and really essentially keep nations and cultures and languages alive. And so when we saw in COVID, communities shut down, that was why. It was to really protect elders. It wasn't because they wanted to shut out the world. It's because those elders hold knowledge that when they pass, it will be no longer, because it was deliberately taken away and shut down, and yet it still survived. And so those elders are very, very precious. I think that our Indigenous colleagues, Raymond can speak to this far better than I can, but what I hear from Dr. Terry Aldred and Dr. Danielle Bean-Smith is, getting into medical school, getting through medical school, getting through residency, and then practicing in a racist healthcare system is really, really hard. And so part of being an ally is really looking to our Indigenous colleagues and seeing ways that we can be allies with them in the systems that we work in, because they watch racism happen and then they experience racism themselves. And so it's a really difficult position that our Indigenous colleagues find themselves in. And just that, what I know from having gone around with the rural site visit through the Rural Coordination Center and looking through the hundreds of communities that we visited and looking through the data that we got from Indigenous communities, is they want us to learn about trauma-informed care. They community after community after community said, can someone teach these doctors about trauma and the impacts and how it shows up in your clinic and how it shows up in the emergency department? So I think those are some of the things that I think are important for us, us as physicians to really be aware of.
Thanks so much, Dana. You said something earlier too when you were talking about advice for those that might want to be on this journey that I think is really important, or what we've seen is really important in this journey, and that's about communities of practice. And when I think about communities of practice or, affinity groups or caucus groups, there's different names for them. I always think about the words of Richard Wagamese. I got to hear him and meet him a couple times. This wonderful writer Indigenous writer who's passed away a few years ago now. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his writing. But I remember he was speaking. This was in Winnipeg, and there was a teacher who was there, and she worked with young Indigenous men who were at risk and who were struggling. And she said, I wasn't able to bring my wonderful students with me tonight, but if I would have, what would you have said to these young Indigenous men that are struggling? And he thought about it for a minute. He didn't answer right away. He took some time, and then he said, I would tell them, you don't do it alone. And then he didn't say much more than that, but that really stuck with me. And I see that need to find those places where we can connect with others who are on this journey and share our successes, share our struggles, share about the mistakes that we've made, and find a way forward based on what you're hearing from others who are on this journey. But I just would like you to speak to the importance of communities of practice, and maybe even what those look like from your experience.
Well, I think that this is something I really took from you, Harley, because I think previously I might have thought about a community of practice where a bunch of white people or non-Indigenous people sit around and talk about how to be better allies. I might have thought, oh, that I'm not sure if that's good practice. I don't know if that's safe. Maybe that's not the right thing to do. We want to do, things with, not about. And what I've come to learn from Harley is that the word caucus is actually an Algonquin word. It's a very Indigenous idea, is to actually come together in groups so that you can then come back into the larger group and bring more. And so communities of practice for me have looked like a few things. One of them is, a group of people that are working as co-journeyers on various projects. And, we try to always make sure that the majority, in some of these projects is that, the majority of our group is Indigenous, but those of us who are not Indigenous, who are working on the project, that we do have a caucus where we do our work. We read, sometimes it'll be we watch a film, we read, we come and challenge each other. We talk about white supremacy. We talk about those things that are real, sometimes really hard, sometimes are real triggers, sometimes are really liberating, whatever it is. So we're challenging each other so that we're not leaning our Indigenous colleagues in the work to educate us and do the work for us, but also so that we have a place to come and share something we thought went well, when something doesn't go well, when there's something that was really hard, maybe when we received some feedback that was hard to hear, and where we really thought, our intention versus our impact was quite different. Maybe a blind spot has just been opened up for us, and it's a safe place to come with other people that are on the same or similar journey, that want to do better, and understand. Also to challenge each other, to sort of say, I hear in this story right now a little bit of this. What about if we looked at it from this perspective? Or so it's been both a safe place and a challenging space, a challenging place to be. But it really is so that we are doing our own work, so that when we go back to co-journey with Indigenous people, we're not asking them to do that work for us. We still need feedback. So that's the other thing, is we don't know if we're culturally safe, if we're an ally, unless we've received feedback from someone who is Indigenous. So, we need to be able to engage with our Indigenous friends and colleagues to get that feedback. But then what do we do with the feedback in a way that really does change our hearts and minds, challenges where we can unlearn together, where we can bring things that inspired us. And because I mean, it's inspiring work, and sometimes it's really hard work, because, you know, we're at the healthcare field because we are carers, and we want to change the world. We want to help heal people. And then when you're told, oh God, Dana, that really hurt, you know, or that was really unhelpful. You know, that runs deep for me. That runs deep for many of us. And so to have a safe place for me to go to, Raul Gupta is another community of practice, the friendship with him, where I can go and we can talk through that and talk about where I responded rather than, or where I reacted rather than responded. So finding those safe places, but also people who will challenge us and who are on the same path, it's essential. I now realize, when Harley first introduced the eye to me, I was cautious about it, but again, whatever Harley tells me, I'm probably going to do. But now I realize it's essential.
Yeah, it's you know, and I like how you said, you know, the work is hard. There's also inspiration in the work, and sometimes that inspiration comes out of, you know, leaning into that hard stuff, right? The other side of that hard stuff is the inspiration, right? It's not either or, it's not separate from one another. You know, that happens a lot, that learning that you can get, that sometimes it almost feels traumatic. And what do they call that? Post-traumatic growth. that happens a lot, I think, in this work. And you can find that insight from others that are, you know, on this journey, that are like you. And so those communities of practice they help us to see the inspiration sometimes when we're really struggling. It's really hard, but you're talking about it with others. They can say, well, have you seen it from this way, or have you thought about this? And then you find the inspiration in those moments. For me, that's one of the wonderful things about having those kinds of communities of practice. So I also wanted to ask you a question too, Dana, about I've always appreciated how you've talked about compassionate leadership and compassionate care, and you've been journeying with the Atleos and learning a lot from them, and I really do enjoy hearing, you know, how that's showing up, or how you talk about that. And I haven't had that privilege of journeying with them closely. I hope to one day. But I'd like to just ask you, you know, what are some of those deeper learnings around compassionate care that you find really helpful for being an ally?
So I've been really fortunate, and there are others on this group who've also been really fortunate to be able to come into relationship and learn from Sean and Heather Atleo, through some funding from the RCCBC and Doctors of BC. We have the ability to bring together some cohorts for people to come and spend a couple of days with them to learn about compassionate leadership and how it can really change healthcare, but how it can change the world. That's really the goal of compassionate leadership. And so they're brilliant thought leaders. Sean, you know, 2 terms as the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. He's a hereditary chief of the Ahousaht Nation. And Heather is a brilliant strategist. She's from the Blackfoot Nation. And they really have put in a decade of learning and really putting together their ideas about neuroplasticity, attachment theory, trauma-informed care, leadership skills, and all wrapped in their beautiful Blackfoot and Ahousaht teachings. And it's been a really transformative experience to get to work with them. And I think what they really realized, so, you know, they have, as Indigenous leaders, they have worked at the highest levels globally to try to change you know, the ever-growing health disparity. Health is only one of the disparities, but health disparity between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people that are happening around the globe, because colonization happened everywhere. There's very few places where it did not impact. And they realized that they were working at the highest levels of internationally, and yet they still saw the gap widening. And they really realized that a different approach really, they went down this journey of really looking at nonviolent communication, compassionate communication, and as I said, neuroplasticity and attachment theory, and have come up with this very brilliant model of compassionate leadership. And it really is about adding no harm. So not saying I will do no harm, because harm happens. We are in this system, we are in this world, harm happens. But how can I try to add no harm to a situation? And part of that is, how can we contribute to the wellness of myself and the other in front of me, even if we don't agree? And so that they're across really fundamental divides, we can still seek to listen and to understand, and that's probably the only thing that will lead to the change we need, and that it's changing hearts and minds. And so I think that's really one of the things that I have found. It's been an incredibly helpful tool, especially when you do engage with someone who really, hasn't done the work, still abides by the history that they were taught in some old textbook, and really sort of says, this isn't my problem. I wasn't there. I didn't do those things. Why do I need to be a part of this? Why should I feel guilty about this? Why? And I think there's a way then to compassionately seek to understand that person, not to seek to change their mind in that moment. Definitely, if there's harm happening, you intervene, right? That's compassionate. If there's harm happening, you intervene. But if there isn't an immediate harm, how can I engage with this person so that I might help them shift to understand? And a lot of that is really understanding what's going on for that person. So, I can think of working on when I worked in one of my remote practices, being at a medical staff meeting, and we were talking about the Emerge department, and some of the folks who are coming in over and over and over again into the Emerge department, and a physician who didn't train wasn't born in Canada, didn't train in Canada, and sort of said, I just don't understand. I came from a war-torn country, and we don't go home and harm our children in the way these people do. We don't get drunk every night. And how do you engage with that person so that you don't actually add harm to them, because that's actually a really traumatized person, right? And so how can you lean into a conversation that sort of says, afterwards, sounds really hard, sounds like you've been through some stuff, tell me about that, in a way where I don't have to agree with what he says, and I can tell him, oh, that was hard for me to hear, but I'm also hearing that there's some stuff going on for you. I just I'm here if you want to talk about some of it, because it's really hard, because we know if we interact in different ways, we can actually entrench someone's racism, we can entrench their pattern, and they can actually leave an interaction with us less safe and more likely to cause harm. So their work, Sean and Heather Atleo, is really transformative. It's about changing hearts and minds by taking care of self and taking care of each other.
Wow. Thank you so much for connecting that compassionate care with you addressed the last question that I had here. My last question was how to reach those seemingly not wanting to learn. So it was really beautiful how you connected that, and really that question came out of the physician advisory group for this work. And so I want to thank that group for considering that, because sometimes we can end up feeling we're not reaching those that maybe don't want to hear, or seemingly not wanting to hear. So I liked how you made that connection through compassion, because really what you're speaking to is setting a tone, right? Because you're not jumping down their throat, which would just escalate them, and then you'd be escalated, and pretty soon, literally, nobody is listening to one another. But through compassion, setting a tone, it helps you to be able to engage with them in a way that maybe helps them to hear something different than what they're carrying in their mind. So I'm not sure if you want to say anything more about reaching those that maybe don't seemingly don't want to hear this or don't see the value in it. And I also want to say to the rest of the group here, we're going to go into a time now of asking, what questions might you have for Dana? And please feel free to utilize the chat, or we'll open it up and you can speak your question at all. But Dana, was there anything else you wanted to add in terms of that, reaching those that seemingly don't want to hear?
I just think the power of vulnerability, of saying, yeah, I know it's hard, and here's where I was, and here's where I am, and also talking about, yeah, here's what I did last week. Oh, that felt really yucky. That ever happened to you? I mean, I just think we're in this together. We're going to be in this for long after I'm gone, long after my kids are gone. We're going to be at this. But if we are working at it together, we're being better ancestors, and our kids will be better ancestors, and that's what keeps me going.
Very nicely said, and it connects to that concept of allyship and journeying together and alliance, and all of those sorts of concepts. So I just thank you so much, Dana, for addressing all the questions that we thought were important in such a wonderful and profound way. And it looks like you've stimulated some comments and some thoughts and some gratitude for what you spoke to. So thank you so much for speaking from your heart and speaking from your experiences and speaking from relationship and speaking from a place of humility as well. So I'd love to just open it up, any thoughts, comments, and you please utilize the chat if you would like as well. We'll keep an eye on it.
I have a question while we're waiting for others. Is the question that showed up is in the chat as a direct message, but the question is, how do we all support and make room for both anti-Indigenous racism work and other type of anti-racism work? Works about the setup for colonial approach currently may create rubs between equity deserving groups.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Dan, I will, ask if you have a response to that as well, but I can just say from the way that we're doing this work around Indigenous cultural safety is we consider it like an entry point into that bigger story, that side of the hill. And colonialism is such a powerful story to show patterns of oppression that aren't just focused on Indigenous people. That's a powerful entry point to see how it's impacted Indigenous people, but then you'll start to see how it's connected with other forms of oppression and the intersections of them as well. So that's the way we've been approaching this work, and we're noticing that it helps to build solidarity, and it helps us to support the work of EDI, let's say, in equity, diversity, and inclusion in some of the organizations. And then folks that are focused on EDI can then support the work that we're doing. So it becomes this powerful way of seeing the connections rather than that they're separate or different. But going back to the entry point into all of this, I think is really powerful in terms of understanding colonizations and the colonization and the perspective of Indigenous people here now, and then that you can then see the connections to other forms of oppression as well. That's a very simple way of saying it. So I don't, Dana, if you'd like to add any thoughts to that.
I don't have very much more to add other than, the intersections are really profound and they're really powerful. And so I don't think it's an either or, I think it's an and colonization harmed people all over this globe. And colonization really led to the sexist world that we live in and the racist world that we live in, and the whole concept of race as a tool, a false tool that was created to allow for colonization. And so I think that there's huge, powerful intersections. I don't think it's an either or, I think it's an and. Great answer, Kurt. It's not a fixed pie. No one says, I just have this much compassion and I'm giving it all to the Indigenous community. it's more of a muscle that gets stronger with exercise. Yeah, really, I love that, Kurt. Thanks.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience. Like Dana mentioned, my own perspective on the sexism that I carry. My entry point into all of this was understanding racism, intentionally looking at racism. But then I started to realize, man, that's the same pattern that I carry with what many women were showing to me of how sexist this world is. So absolutely, it's a really wonderful saying, that muscle that you build in looking at these at oppression really helps you to see it showing up in other areas as well. Anybody else have a question? Please feel free to voice your question as well. Or reflections or comments. Okay, I see Leslie's hand.
And thank you both very much. I'm sorry I had to nip out there, so I may have missed something here, but I wanted to ask if a physician was interested in joining a community of practice that you describe. Dana, you mentioned Dr. Gupton, yourself. What would be a good way to go about that? Like, could I just, suggest they reach out to you directly? How would you prefer to do that?
Certainly, I'm really happy to have a conversation with you, Leslie. Absolutely. So reach out. I'm happy to put my email in there and we can talk about that. But I think it's really about creating a community of practice. It's nothing formal. It's, it's really finding out who's in your sphere that has the same questions, that has the same hopes and desires for a different world, and then saying, hey, do you want to meet once a month for a cup of tea? And I'm here for you if you just need to pick up the phone because there's something that's really bugging you. I mean, I think it's kind of like that. It's finding a sponsor, right? It's trying to change a pattern. It's making sure you've got a group to come to hold you to account, and to also support you and hold you up. But I'm really happy to have a conversation about what that could look like for you, Leslie. And probably you have those people in your sphere.
Well, and what I think I'll do, Dana, is I'm an executive director of a division. So what I'd like to do is introduce you electronically or somehow to some of the physicians in our community.
Which community are you in, Leslie?
In South Island, in
Okay.
South Vancouver Island. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Dana's put her email into the chat, and I see Dr. Chaboyer.
Thank you. Excellent information there, Dana and Harley. I just wanted to say that, I want to make it clear and acknowledge that this work is not easy and it's not quick. We're not trying to push forward that idea that this is something that with a few sessions you can kind of change things quickly. It required this kind of work where you approach the patient with cultural humility, requires a doctor to give up some of their power. And as a doctor, whether you know it or not, as a family doctor, you might think of yourself as not very powerful, but I guarantee you are. You're the main entry point for a person who may be dealing with a very significant medical problem, and you're their main entry point for help in a medical system for some people that has been very, very racist. And those people can be very easily triggered, and you need to be aware of that when you're approaching patients who may have had those types of experiences. So just wanted to make it clear that this is not a quick and easy process. The other thing I'll say is that, in the work that I've done, I've come to realize that I'm not sure that the patient, my patient, gets full benefit of seeing me as an Indigenous safe physician, someone who understands them and someone who can really help them until I've been working with them maybe for a few years. It may take that long for the patient to fully trust that I'm just not part of the system where they've had very negative experiences in the past, and that I'm actually worthy of their trust, and that I'm willing to listen and I'm willing to help. And even as an Indigenous physician, I think that that takes time, and it requires sort of an awareness on my part to let down that cloak, take off the white coat, sit down and talk with people face to face, let them know who I am. It's not enough to say I'm Dr. Shaboye, I'm here to help you. For some patients, that actually might have a negative connotation. So you need to be aware of that, and just, be kind enough to yourself to be aware that this isn't a quick and easy process. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for saying that, Ray. I that need for practicing vulnerability too. Like, so how do you speak from a place of vulnerability to let somebody know about yourself? And sometimes we end up thinking that vulnerability is soft, but it's really a sign of strength, right? That if you can share from that depth of who you are, and there's that can go a long way for building trust when somebody feels that there's a depth to you, beyond the white coat and the credentials and that sort of thing. But you're a human, and you're meeting another human. I think that's just so important. Thank you so much. And I see C Edge. Sorry, I don't know your first name. See your hand up though.
Hello, I'm Kathy Edge. I'm a GP, and I'm phoning in from Wellington, New Zealand. But you could probably hear from my accent that I am a Canadian born, but I've lived half my life in New Zealand. And hello, Leslie. We know each other from the island. Thank you, everybody who's participating. It's great. I have an observation from my own life that I grew up and went to university in Canada, and then I moved to New Zealand, married a New Zealander, and we raised our children over here in trying to be bicultural. And when I came to New Zealand, I'm very proud to hear it was the Maori nurses who got us the definition. I didn't know that. But the cultural competency has been talked about the whole 30 years I've been in New Zealand. But to me, the cultural stuff was exciting and new, and I didn't have an emotional connection to it. So I could approach it as a new country. I'm an immigrant. I'm interested in this. I'm interested in a different set of people. And I also was raised, my father really thought other people were really exciting and interesting. And we had Bishop Tutu for lunch at my house once when I was a teenager. Anyway, but so, and we do a lot of cultural competency training here in New Zealand, and sometimes you have to roll your eyes because you do it so much. But I recognize that the Indigenous people of this country that I've chosen as my home is really important. And we have a lot of immigrants who also have cultural safety needs that are important too. But because I live in New Zealand, I have a primary responsibility to the Maori people, because that is our colonial history of damage. And that works pretty well for me. When I come home to Canada, I get really emotionally connected in a way. I get angry that Canada seemed, and the medical council was so slow to pick up on this whole discussion, or at least in my awareness. But I do, because it talks to who I am from the beginning of my childhood, which is so subconscious in a way. And I realized how much I internalized about how we think about Indians, because that's how it was phrased when I was a girl. Despite all my quite thinking open-mindedness, I still get a little bit sensitive about Indians. And I practice being First Nations and respectful, and I like individuals, but I have to recognize that what was societally put into me all those years ago comes out, and I have quite a different reaction when I'm talking about Canadian cultural sensitivity compared to New Zealand cultural sensitivity. And I don't know, maybe this is helpful to other people who are immigrants or have moved in different parts of the world, to be aware of those things. I'm not as wonderful in some places as I sometimes think I am. And the other thing is about power and about being a GP. So I went out of medicine for 20 years while I raised my children, and I became just a mom, a foreigner, woman without an income. And that feminist stuff was very strong. And then I come back into medicine, and I think it's just for me to be helpful, but the way people treat me now is very different than they did when I did not have the doctor badge on my chest. And I like that power. I like being able to speak with influence in people's lives, but I see how unfair that whole setup is that allows me to talk to people when I'm no different than I was 10 years ago. So I don't know how that helps the conversation, but that's just some of my lived experience of the cultural awareness and how important it is that we notice it and can respond as best we can in the moment. And that power imbalance is really, really important. Thank you for letting me sort of tag on to this Canadian experience through it, thanks to Doctors of BC.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edge. And maybe Dana, I'll ask you if you have any response, but I just want to point out to the participants here, the way that Dr. Edge spoke was from a place of understanding. And did you notice the difference between knowledge and understanding? I mean, knowledge is wonderful, of course, but she really brought in her, like she was in the midst of all of that, right? And that's where she was sharing from. And that there's a lot of profoundness when we can share from that place. And that's the kind of thing you kind of hear in communities of practice, that lived experience, that deeper understanding. So I just wanted to point that out, what I noticed. Dana, did you want to respond in any way?
Just say also the noticing is that it's stored in our body, and so yes, you have a different reaction to something that was when we all started, we learned those unconscious patterns, and that's what this work is. It's like it's bringing those unconscious patterns into the consciousness so that we can then change them. And the other thing that it makes me think of is that you might be, it certainly has been helpful for me, and it might be helpful for you, Dr. Edge, is the work of Tema Oken. It makes me think about some of the white supremacy culture and the ways that we are taught to be defensive, the ways that we are taught to try to be perfect. And I just wonder, for me, that's actually been a really liberating study, the work of Tema Oken. And it might be really helpful with some of the things that I've heard you sharing there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, I'm noticing the time that we just have a few moments left with one another, but if anybody else would like to make a comment or reflection. I think I see Tom Ashton, I see your hand.
Yes, I just want to thank you, Harley, Dana, and Raymond for your very deep comments. I come from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Silk Nation in Penticton. And along with it, at our hospital, they say live, learn, collaborate, and work together. But from what I heard you say earlier, it's really, if we take the nouns and turn them into verbs, it's living, learning, collaborating, and working together, or journeying together. And that's really so beautiful. And I I'm not normally a spontaneous or natural person, so this does not come easy to me. And I'll just give you one story, as I'm a retired physician. But I was asked to give a talk in Karamias a number of years ago, and I arrived at the basement of this church where the First Nations people were meeting, and I had my 60 slides. And the first thing somebody said to me, well, the slide projector doesn't work. And that is where I had to, all of a sudden, it was a heart-to-heart conversation. And really, it fulfilled these points that you've mentioned today, just that heart-to-heart conversation. So it was a good place to start. Thank you very much for this lovely presentation. I feel that I am just a little bit more aware. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashton. And I think we've come to the end of our time here. Dana, any closing words, any thoughts that you want to share in the few seconds that we have left?
No, just really honored to be here. Honored that there's 80 some people that took the time to be a part of this conversation. Reach out. I'm happy. I'm on this journey together. It's not a perfect journey that I'm on, but I'm on it, and I'm happy to co-journey with others.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dana. Thank you, Dana, for being here with me and to have this wonderful interaction. We're so lucky that we get to have these interactions just in our regular life quite often. So thank you, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for the wisdom that was shared too from others. Your comments in the chat and what you shared here and with your voice as well. Just so thankful for your presence here tonight, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a month at March 9th for the last in the series of 5 sessions. All right. Thank you, everybody.